death, disease, cancer, injuries, surgeries, paralysis, disabilities, Alzheimer's, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, layoffs, house fires, break-ins, losing relationships, being hurt by people we love, divorce, abuse, ridicule, accidents, wars, persecutions. There are many storms in this life. Most people find themselves being lost and wandering in the ocean of life, being driven by the waves and winds that are constantly pounding against them. So many are fearful, depressed, and worried. Others don't seem to recognize or care that they are lost and in very dangerous waters. Yet there's another option while facing the storms of life. The scriptures speak of an anchor. Hebrews 6 and verse 19 says, "We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure." It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain. The hope of eternal life in heaven through Jesus Christ is the only thing that is strong enough to endure every storm we encounter during this life. This anchor for the soul is firm and it is secure. There's no breaking it. Unfortunately, there are many people who are either unaware that such an anchor exists, or they keep their anchors away, that is, not released, so that even though they know about this anchor, they're not using it to its full potential. So there's a great need to learn about our anchor God has provided us and the challenges of this life so we can overcome life's challenges through faith and hope. In this first lesson, we'll work to develop the proper outlook on the storms of life we experience and that threaten to destroy us spiritually. Whether you're going through a storm right now or whether you will face them in the future, you must have the right outlook on the storms so you'll respond to them properly. To help us think about facing these storms, we'll be considering Job's story, particularly in Job 1 through 3, and draw some lessons applicable to our storms. Number one, let's recognize that bad things happen to good people. The storms of life are not prejudice. They eventually hit everyone. They don't just target those who are wicked. In fact, they often hit the most morally pure people living on this earth, and sometimes they are even the ones who are the hardest hit. Let's notice about Job that Job was blameless. He was a blameless and upright man. Listen to how we're introduced to the man named Job in Job 1, verses 1 through 5. It says, "There was a man in the country of Uz named Job. He was a man of complete integrity, who feared God and turned away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. His estate included 7,000 sheep and goats, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large number of servants. Job was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His sons used to take turns having banquets at their homes. They would send an invitation to their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. Whenever a round of banqueting was over, Job would send for his children and purify them, rising early in the morning to offer burnt offerings for all of them. For Job thought, 'Perhaps my children have sinned, having cursed God in their hearts.' This was Job's regular practice." Here was a very righteous man. He seemed to be doing everything right as far as living in a way that pleased God. And not only do we see Job as a very conscientious man about his own righteousness, but he was also concerned with his children being right with God. After their days of feasting, he would get up early and offer sacrifices for each one of them in case they had sinned and cursed God. And then notice that this was Job's regular practice. Now, as the story of Job begins in these verses, you observe that Job is a wealthy man with a large family, 7 sons and 3 daughters. But this man was about to experience some terrible things. Job chapter 1, verse 13 through chapter 2, verse 8 describes a series of events that brought great suffering on this righteous man. First, a messenger came to Job and told Job that he was the lone survivor when the Sabaeans attacked while Job's oxen and donkeys were plowing, and they were all taken away, and his servants were all killed with a sword. Job 1, verses 13 through 15. While that messenger was still speaking, another messenger came saying that he was the lone survivor of a fire that fell from God in heaven, which burned up the sheep and the servants. Job 1, verse 16. And then while that messenger was still speaking, another messenger came saying that he was the lone survivor of a raid by 3 bands of the Chaldeans who took the camels away and killed more of his servants. Job 1, verse 17. And while that messenger was still speaking, another messenger came bringing the worst news of all. This one said that he was the lone survivor from the place that Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking. He said that a great wind came and struck the house so that it fell on and killed all Job's children. Job 1, verses 18 and 19. Surely, there could rarely be a day in life that was worse than this one. Job's life suddenly turned from the calm he had experienced to being thrown into the middle of a fierce storm. Job was later afflicted with terrible boils from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Job 2, verse 7. And then Job sat in the middle of ashes. He used a broken piece of pottery to scrape himself. Job 2 and verse 8. So let's notice then that suffering will happen that is unrelated to how we live. Like with Job, bad things happen to everyone. It is an unavoidable reality of life. Now, it should be noted that sometimes people bring suffering on themselves. That is, wicked decisions often result in self-inflicted suffering. But this lesson's not focused on the storms of life we bring on ourselves. If any of your storms are self-inflicted, you must first stop the action or actions that are causing these consequences and turn to God. And then God can help you endure these storms through many of the same principles we'll discuss. Yet, even when you're not bringing trouble on yourself, we simply live in a world where trouble, sorrow, pain, and death will be experienced. And this will be experienced by the righteous and the wicked alike. This is because we live in a world in which sin and death are present. Sometimes our suffering is a direct result of foolish and wicked decisions. Sometimes our suffering accomplishes a righteous purpose from God. Sometimes our suffering is the result of our faith being tested, and sometimes our suffering is the product of time and chance. On this point, Ecclesiastes 9 verse 11 observes, "Again, I saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, or the battle to the strong, or bread to the wise, or riches to the discerning, or favor to the skillful. Rather, time and chance happen to all of them." Yes, in this fallen world, sometimes bad things happen to us. Sometimes people are in the wrong place at the wrong time. And our suffering is not always connected to something evil that we've done, just like Job's suffering was not connected with anything evil he had done. But next, let's notice as we face the storms of life that God is in control. It's essential for us to recognize that. There may be times we begin to question whether this is so. Since so many bad things are happening to and around us. But then we must also not blame God and turn away from Him when we experience suffering. Let's know that God is over all. Consider how God was in control even when all the bad things were happening to Job. The Scriptures provide a behind-the-scenes look into Job's suffering that not even Job was privy to. Listen to Job 1, verses 6 through 12. One day, the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord asked Satan, "Where have you come from?" "From roaming through the earth," Satan answered him, "and walking around on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity, who fears God and turns away from evil." Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and everything he owns? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he owns, and he will surely curse you to your face." "Very well," the Lord told Satan. "Everything he owns is in your power. However, do not lay a hand on Job himself." So Satan left the Lord's presence. Satan used this permission and power to bring about suffering for Job through the loss of his livestock, servants, and children. And then after Satan had caused all this suffering for Job in these ways, Satan wanted more and inflicted Job with the painful boils. Listen to Job 2, verses 1 through 6. One day, the sons of God came again to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord asks Satan, "Where have you come from?" "From roaming through the earth," Satan answered him, "and walking around on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity, who fears God and turns away from evil. He still retains his integrity, even though you incited me against him to destroy him for no good reason." "Skin for skin," Satan answered the Lord. "A man will give up everything he owns in exchange for his life. But stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." "Very well," the Lord told Satan. "He is in your power. Only spare his life." Now, while I don't understand everything about what's going on in these passages, one thing that should be abundantly clear is God is in control. I want you to recognize that Satan could not just do whatever he desired. Even as powerful and influential as the Bible teaches Satan to be, he is not more powerful than God. Satan could only do these things to Job whenever God agreed to allow Job's faith to be put to the test in these ways. And recognize that God put a limit on Satan that Satan could not ignore. No matter how much Satan could have wanted to push Job a little more, God was the one in ultimate control. Next, while God is ultimately in control, we also learn that God is not the one to blame whenever we experience storms in life. Yet that's how many people react when the storms of life hit, and they use these experiences to separate them from God. For example, Job's wife told Job, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." Job 2 and verse 9. Job's initial response to his suffering should help us to refuse to blame God whenever we are caught in the storms of life. Job told his wife, "You speak as a foolish woman speaks. Should we accept only good from God and not adversity?" Job 2 verse 10. And then God tells us throughout all this, Job did not sin in what he said. And after Job had lost his wealth and children, Job 1, verses 20 to 22 says, "Then Job stood up, tore his robe, and shaved his head. He fell to the ground and worshipped, saying, 'Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will leave this life. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.'" Throughout all this, Job did not sin or blame God for anything. Job simply recognized that God is in control. Every good thing he had was from God. So, just as giving the good things was in God's control, taking those things away was also in God's control. And rather than accusing God of wrongdoing, Job recognized that God must be worshiped and held in high esteem, even though Job was greatly sorrowful. Today we must recognize that even though God is in control of all things, God is not the reason suffering and death exist in this world. Instead, God created this world as a true paradise when man and woman were in the Garden of Eden. However, through Satan's temptation and the sin Adam and Eve committed, suffering and death were brought into the world as consequences for rebelling against God. And this continues today. Yet for all the storms of life God allows to happen, He always uses them to accomplish a righteous purpose. You see, God's not trying to be cruel, nor does He just want to see His creation experience hardships. Instead, God always has a perfectly righteous plan for the sufferings He allows to happen. Sometimes they are the result of His righteous wrath to punish evil. Sometimes they are the result of His discipline to try to get people to turn from their wickedness. Sometimes they are tests to see if we will be faithful to Him and trust in Him. Sometimes they are used to teach us to trust in God. There are many reasons, even far beyond our comprehension, God allows these sufferings to happen. Therefore, rather than blaming God, we must humble ourselves and continue to bless the name of the great God. Well, next, let's notice that we have an enemy. Although God is in control, we must also recognize that we have an enemy who does not want what is best for us. Unlike God, who wants us to do what is right, there is one who is trying to tempt us and lure us away from God, and this one is Satan. Satan roams the earth. Remember that Satan is the one who desired for Job to experience such a great storm in his life. He was among those required to present themselves before the Lord, Job 1 and verse 6. And when God asked Satan where he had come from, Satan answered, "From roaming through the earth and walking around on it," Job 1 verse 7. Every picture of Satan in the Bible demonstrates that he is not your friend. Instead, the reference to him as Satan means that he is an adversary. He is one who opposes us. He's simply not interested in our well-being, particularly on a spiritual level. Instead, his mission is to lead us away from God. Therefore, as he walks around on this earth even today, he's looking to harm us. For instance, 1 Peter 5 and verse 8 says, "Be sober-minded, be alert, because your adversary, the devil, is prowling around like a roaring lion, looking for anyone he can devour." Now, all suffering can be traced back to Satan. Remember that it was Satan who wanted Job to suffer. When God asked Satan if he had considered his servant Job, Satan thought of how he could possibly lure Job away from God. Satan asked whether Job feared God for nothing, since God had blessed Job with so much. Job 1 verses 9 and 10. Satan concluded that if God would take away what Job had, Job would surely curse God to his face. Job 1 and verse 11. And God allowed Satan to put Job to the test, provided that Satan did not harm Job physically, and then later, so long as Job would not be killed. So, once again, we see two very different perspectives. God had confidence in Job and wanted to use the tests to prove Job's faithfulness. However, Satan wanted Job to fall. He brought all of this suffering on Job so that Job would curse God. The Scriptures demonstrate that although God can use suffering to accomplish His righteous purposes, all suffering can be traced back to Satan, just as it was with Job. Sometimes it can be traced directly back to Satan. For example, sometimes the storms we experience in life are the direct result of listening to Satan's temptations and sinning against God. But even if our suffering is not directly connected with Satan in the sense of a specific sin that has caused the suffering, it is still indirectly traced back to Satan. As I've mentioned already, God did not create this world to experience suffering and death. Instead, He placed the man and woman He created in the garden, or in the paradise of the Garden of Eden. And because He had created them with free will, He gave them a law that said they must not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In doing so, God warned them. There would be consequences for breaking the law, saying that they would surely die if they broke the law. Genesis 2, verses 16 and 17. And then Satan enters the Bible story for the very first time. Using the serpent, he tempted Eve by telling her things that appealed to her fleshly desires, as you read about in Genesis 3, verses 1 to 5. And she gave in to the temptation by eating the forbidden fruit, and also gave it to her husband, Genesis 3 and verse 6. The rest of Genesis 3 goes on to describe the consequences they experienced, including suffering, physical suffering, and death. Today, all the physical suffering and death can be traced back to this time when it first entered the world. And we should recognize that Satan was behind it. Therefore, he is indirectly involved in all of the sufferings we continue to experience today because he was responsible for helping it enter the world. But next, let's learn that sometimes when it rains, it pours. When we suffer, sometimes we are fortunate enough to only have to deal with one thing at a time. But there are other times when it seems like everything is falling apart at once. Sometimes it feels as if there is a superstorm that has engulfed us and we are struggling to see through it. Sometimes it feels as if the storm is pounding against us relentlessly and there seems to be no way out. Sometimes, when it rains, it pours. Think about all the sufferings, all the things Job experienced within a short period of time. Put yourself in his position. You're living the kind of righteous life that you know you should be living. You're so focused on being right with God and care so much about your children that you're even making sacrifices for them. And up to this point, you've been greatly blessed by God. And then, all of a sudden, without any warning, you get the first messenger delivering the news about your oxen and donkeys being stolen and your servants being killed. And then, before he can finish telling you about what happened and before you can fully react to that news, another messenger comes to you and says that fire came down from the sky and burned up your sheep and more of your servants. And then before he can finish telling you that news, another messenger says that a raid took away all your camels and killed even more of your servants. And then before he's finished, and when you may just begin thinking that you've heard the worst, another messenger comes to you and says that all 10 of your children were killed by a house collapsing in the wind. And sometime after this, your own health severely deteriorates with painful boils all over your body, and you lose the support of your own spouse. Now that is a bad day. Seemingly out of nowhere, Job went from being an extremely wealthy man with 10 children and in seemingly good health to a poor and childless man scraping himself with broken pieces of pottery. Yet sometimes the storms of life are that fast and furious. They rip us from our comfortable sense of normalcy and threaten to throw us into complete sorrow, confusion, and chaos. Sometimes we'll face tests that seem unbearable. Have you ever had a time in your life like Job? Whether you experienced as much loss and heartache as Job did on this occasion or not, you may have experienced a time in your life in which everything that could go wrong seemed to go wrong. Maybe you had to deal with a couple deaths at one time, several health difficulties, financial problems, family problems, etc. And maybe several of these things happened all at the same time or in a relatively short period of time. During these times, it's often difficult to recognize that we can make it through. Sometimes it seems as if the storms are howling so much that surely everything will just fall apart. Job 3 begins to describe how Job's situation continued affecting him. He began to curse the day that he was born and wish he had died at birth. Job 3 verses 1 to 13. Job even longed for death, and it would not come. Job 3 verses 20 to 23. He said, I sigh when food is put before me, and my groans pour out like water, for the thing I feared has overtaken me, and what I dreaded has happened to me. I cannot relax or be calm. I have no rest, for turmoil has come. Job 3 verses 24 to 26. Yet none of this was more than Job was capable of enduring. Remember that God was in control and only allowed Satan to do so much. In the same way, God knows what we're capable of enduring, better than we know ourselves. After all, He is the one who has created us. So even though we may think we have reached our breaking points, the fact that we're still alive and going through the storms means that God knows that we can endure it. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13 says, No temptation has come upon you except what is common to humanity. But God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation He will also provide a way out so that you may be able to bear it. Then, let's notice, as we face the storms of life, that we don't always know why. Perhaps the thing that makes the storms of life most difficult is trying to understand why they happen. And although the Bible does help us understand some general facts about our suffering, as we've even considered in this lesson, the simple truth is that we may never fully understand what is behind our suffering while we live on this earth. You see, Job never knew why. Of all the suffering Job experienced, we are never told that Job learned what had went on behind the scenes. In fact, it appears as if he did not know. Although we're given information concerning God and Satan and why Job experienced these things, Job did not have these answers. Interestingly, even when the Lord spoke to Job in chapters 38 to 41, God did not tell Job why it all happened. Instead, God just helped Job appreciate how great He is and how little mankind really knows and controls in comparison. And like Job, there are many things we'll experience in life that we will not fully understand. So, rather than thinking we must have all the answers, we must learn to simply trust in God and patiently endure the storms. For there are many times people become discouraged and turn away from God because they don't get answers that satisfy them. But we must choose to maintain integrity. I want you to consider two responses to the same situation and not understanding the reason why. Remember, although the book of Job focuses on Job, he was not the only one who would have experienced the storm. Consider the fact that his wife also experienced the loss of her husband's wealth, her 10 children, supposing they were all her children, and watched her husband be afflicted with painful boils all over his body to the point that he became almost unrecognizable to those who knew him. Job 2 and verse 12. The implication is that she also did not know why any of this had happened. In response to the situation, Job's wife did not demonstrate moral integrity. Rather than having faith in God and patiently enduring the sufferings, she criticized her husband for doing so and wanted him to curse God before he died. Job 2 verse 9. She had allowed the storms to embitter her against God. Yet Job did not respond in the same way. In fact, Job acted with integrity and provides an example of endurance for us today. James 5 verse 11. Through the early days of his suffering, he worshiped God, blessed the name of the Lord, and did not sin or charge God with wrong, as we saw from Job 1 verses 20 to 22 and Job 2 verse 10. However, we should also point out that as time went on, Job did make some mistakes. For example, by the end of the book, we see Job repenting for speaking about things he did not understand, things that were too wondrous for him to know. Job 42 verses 1 through 6. This happened after God had answered Job's complaints by demonstrating his great power, wisdom, and sovereignty over everything. And hearing this caused Job to recognize his need to simply trust in God. So, how will you respond when you face the storms of life? Will you hold fast to your integrity and honor God in your life? Or will you turn away from God, blame Him, or act like those who have no hope because they don't serve God? Please recognize that you can choose to maintain your integrity before God, even as you endure the fiercest of storms in life. Regardless of what happens in your life and how difficult of storms you will experience, recognize that God is in control and maintain your trust in Him. In conclusion, we will all experience storms during this life. Some will be fiercer than others. The story of Job helps us learn many powerful lessons that will help us through our own storms. But as we learn through Job, we can control how we respond to these storms. If we'll cling to our anchor during these times, we'll faithfully endure the storms and experience tremendous spiritual blessings. But if we do not hold on to the one anchor that will hold us, we will surely become lost at sea and headed for spiritual destruction. Thanks be to God that He provides this anchor of hope through Jesus Christ that will help us face the storms of life.